All right, everybody, good morning or good afternoon, as the case may be. It is 11 o'clock by my watch in Chicago, so it's time to begin. Good morning. Thank you for attending this POWERcast. I inherited an IBM Please Help by Chuck Lazinski, Ash Giddings, and Tom Huntington of HelpSystems. This POWERcast is sponsored by HelpSystems. If you have any technical issues during the presentation, go ahead and send me a chat message. I'm Ian Carrate, and send it to me, and I will address your issue. Of course, there's always Zoom help. If you need to, you can just Google away. If you would like to send in written questions to Chuck, Ash, or Tom during the presentation, use that during the Q&A portion on the right down bottom front of your screen, and they will answer the question at the end of the presentation as time permits. Chuck is presenting first and is going to introduce everybody. Chuck, go ahead, take us away.
All right, thanks, Ian. Appreciate it. So let's just assume that maybe you're new to IBM. Maybe you've spent your career as a network admin or maybe a developer in the Windows or Unix world. Perhaps you've recently lost your IBM talent and now you need to initiate your new hire to this thing we call IBM. So before you push them over the cliff without a parachute, just hang in there. This webinar is designed as their initiation into this thing we call IBM running on Power. My name is Chuck Lazinski. I'm the Director of Technical Solutions here at HelpSystems, and long time on IBM, about 30 years. Actually, I got my IBM 30-year shirt on today. All right. And
Nice.
I'm joined with a couple of my friends, Tom and Ash. Ash, what's your background? How long have you been on I?
Yeah, I was just thinking. I think I'm about 30 years as well. I know I don't look old enough, but yeah, I kind of started in and around System 8, 38, and almost kind of bumped into AS400 IBM back in the day. So yeah, but about 30 years. Started off with an insurance company, and that was really a mainframe shop, and the 38 and AS400 was a bit of an inconvenience. So I picked up that inconvenience and ran with it, and and now we are today, 30 years later.
That's how a lot of us get started on this platform. Tom.
Well, that makes Ash a bleeding edge technology guy then, right? If that's how he started. I guess I was kind of in the same boat. I started in a large agribusiness company and had a little bit of exposure to System 34, 36, and 38 there. And then, of course, AS400 I-Series and now IBM. And I'm our EVP of Technical Solutions at HelpSystems. Very excited to be here with you. Ash and I are both very involved in, well, actually all three of us are very involved in different organizations on Power. I happen to be a Power champion, have been that for 5 years, and very, very excited to be part of that group and hear what's going on. Ash, you sit on the Common
Europe Advisory Council, CEAC. Yeah, so we have a say as to what goes in and what doesn't go into our wonderful operating system. And it's a great group, one from each European country typically. So
and as a Power champion, we talk across not only IBM, but we talk about AIX. We even talk about Red Hat Linux these days, and SUSE, and all those things that can run on IBM. And then Chuck, you run our local Q user, or you're heavily involved, I should say.
Yeah, heavily involved, vice president of our local Q user organization, IBM Power or IBM Power user group, and we're going to talk about that today. It's one of our topics as to how to get moving in IBM and increase your education level. But we're going to start with a polling question. Ian, if you want to go ahead and launch the polling question. We're curious, what was your background before you inherited IBM? And we talk to a lot of different companies. Tom and Ash and I all talk to a lot of different companies about who's running IBM now. And we're running into more and more where it could be the network admin who is now running IBM. So what's your background? Tom, Ash, what have you been seeing?
Well, yeah, I think it used to have a dedicated person, but I think people wear many hats now, and it's not uncommon for developers or people that typically support other platforms to be given the task of supporting this this box. So yeah, that's kind of what I see, Chuck.
And I think over the top of that, you put the management. I see in talking to more managers in IT that they may or may not have an IBM I AS400 background, or they've come back to the platform and said, oh my gosh, to our topic today, I inherited an IBM I server, right?
Right. Well, and if we could share our summary results, Ian.
Yeah, they are up now.
Oh,
Chuck.
okay. Yep. Got them. Yep. And you know, one of the one of the groups that is well represented once again, this is the second time we've done this presentation, are the developers. And being the AS400 at one time application system, it makes sense that the developer community is heavily involved in the administration of this system, but we're seeing it even more so now.
I call out the admins from other platforms, right? And so this will be a good session for you how to navigate. So let's roll into our agenda. We're going to talk about the landscape around the IBM I community. We're green screen versus GUI, menus, commands, and help, getting work done, and some advanced topics. So one of the things that we put out at HelpSystems is the IBM I Marketplace study. We started that 7 years ago, working on our 8th year of that, and for 2021 we'll be posting results here in the first part of 2021 in January. Take the survey now. It is opened up until October 9th, so you have a few more days left, but we appreciate you taking the survey. So take that survey. And speaking of the survey from last year, you know, we tied that into this topic because one of the top items, the 4th item, was IBM I skills. So skills mean a lot of different things to people, and skills leaving the platform maybe is what people are concerned about, or I don't have the skill to run the platform. You know, what am I going to do, right? So from our perspective, you have to be willing to hire non-IBM I talent and really change the set of tools that you're using as you're doing that. If you're going to hire a new developer, you got to get out of PDM, you got to get out of SEU, you got to get them into open source technology on IBM I, or using RDI for doing your development. And then you have to reach out to your local colleges and universities to work with them and helping them to grow. There are colleges out there that do train people around this platform. Chuck talked about the local user groups. Those are great places for education. And the reality is, I tell people that IBM I skill shortage is just aligned with the rest of the technology world. There is a skills shortage around the globe in IT. And it's only going to get worse over the next 10 years. There are some huge predictions out there that it's going to get worse even. So then, you know, I know Chuck and Ash and myself, when we started on this platform, we didn't start with RPG on our mind. I learned it. How about you, Chuck?
Yeah, exactly. On the job. On the job. Ash?
Yeah, you're right. No real formal training. You tend to get dropped in at the deep end, and it's either sink or swim. But
right.
Yeah, totally, Tom.
Right, and you know, so after a month, you know what you're doing, right? That's the way it works. And then again, there's a lot of great publications around it, IT Jungle, Common, themselves, IBM Systems Magazine, etc. So then we look at the demographics of our survey, and you know, back in the day, IBM used to always promote that about a third of the IBM I servers are based in North America and the rest outside the world. Our survey captures a different demographic. We're at a 60-40 split, and that's partially because the HelpSystems database is very North America oriented. Now, the other thing that we do is we look at industries, and people think, oh, manufacturing's gone away, but yet there's a lot of manufacturing on this platform, a lot of banking and financing, distribution, warehousing technology, of course, software developers, retail, insurance, healthcare. And basically my point here is all the major industries and even government run on IBM I. And then we start looking at staffing on IBM I. One of the things that's really interesting about this platform, and the good and bad of it, is that if you look at our survey result, 51% of the market had one or less administrators, right? Think about that. Who in their right mind would run their Windows servers without 2 or 3 Windows administrators? So there's kind of that political issue that you have in running the platform in itself that just because you don't have as many people that are needed to run the platform is really comes down to. And then based on what you heard from Gartner and others in the past, you would hear that, you know, nobody's doing development on this platform, but our survey shows that there's a good portion of people doing development. And the thing that's always made IBM I zing in the industry is its productivity for developers. And so you can get a lot done on this platform because the database is just part of the operating system and other things that are integrated that we'll talk about today. And then IBM has this program going called Fresh Faces coming to IBM I and helping to promote the fact that there are new people that are joining the workforce that are doing some neat things on IBM I. And really, if you have any of those people on your staffs, we would like to help make them famous from around the world. I look at these faces and I smile because I think there's 3 or 4 of them that I've given to IBM over the years to say, hey, here's somebody you should be talking to. So Fresh Faces is a great program that they continue to do. And then we talk about the power of systems user groups. And, you know, user groups are really the heartbeat. And Chuck, maybe a little over to you on that one. And what are your thoughts? Or Ash, rather?
Yeah, I think I agree. They are definitely the heartbeat of the IBM I ecosystem. And I think they're like no other platform, really. They're great bunches. I've attended user groups both in the States and throughout EMEA, and everybody is just so willing to help. And these they tend to be kind of aimed at education. You know, there's no hard sells even from the vendors. The vendors are doing educational discussions and content. So I think they're absolutely invaluable. I love going to them. Absolutely love it. And I don't know if anybody's on from EMEA, because we did this in EMEA last week. But here's just a list of some of the user groups in my region. I think we're probably missing a couple on here. There's Common Iberia for Spain and Portugal, and I would say yeah, a good probably 90% of content is education based. And then I guess the umbrella group for all of this is Common Europe, which hosts its annual Congress and again educational webinars throughout the year. So worth keeping an eye on those too.
I think we have to expand this to Southeast Asia, right?
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and the user groups in the US and Canada are well represented across the country. Very active user groups providing a lot of different educational opportunities and also workshops. For instance, our Q user group in the Twin Cities area, we had a really well attended workshop on SQL on IBM I. And that was provided by an outside entity that came in, and we were able to host that. All of our meetings are online, and likewise, you'll be seeing other groups go completely virtual for obviously a number of reasons, but also because we don't support just the Twin Cities area. We support members from other states, Ohio, Texas, Nebraska. So we've got a number of folks who have joined outside of the Minneapolis, Twin Cities area. And Tom, I know you've presented at a number of these organizations.
I have over the years. I've been in all kinds of little places talking about AS what, right?
What?
You know, if we move on, you know, really, what is IBM I? It's one of those things we shouldn't assume that everybody knows what it is, right? It's an operating system. Matter of fact, it's one of 3 operating systems that can run on an IBM Power Systems server. Power Systems servers run the IBM Power server processor called Power 9 today. And we know that there's a future, there's going to be, you know, a Power 10 coming out. And it, you know, alongside of IBM I, AIX, and Linux, you can run even environments like Watson's environment and AI type technology. But what makes IBM I unique amongst these 3 operating systems is that it has that built-in database. It has object-oriented technology. It has a thing called work management, which, you know, in today's world, you almost think of that as a container management type environment where you can run multiple workloads. That's why people can buy one IBM I server and not need 10 more to run their business, because they can put multiple business applications on the same server. You have both internal and external disks. Security is built into every object. It's arguably one of those issues though, did everybody use it properly? Scalability, certainly we can scale the server. It does run in the cloud. We have many different cloud providers today out there, from MSPs to just platform as a service type providers. Supports the traditional technologies along with open source. I literally could have wrote a program back in 1988 that could still be running today and not have needed to be changed, as IBM has transitioned to this, to a more modern environment. And of course, high availability and backup and all those things are part of it too that make this a very recoverable platform. So if we look at the long history, this is a very long lineage back to the System 3s really, and IBM's march, and when they created the System 38 platform in 1979. There's a nice book out there called the AS400 Insiders, written by Frank Soltis many years ago, that talks about going to Rochester to build this new platform. And then the merger of System 36 into AS400 that came out in 1988, all with that database built into it. And then as we've made this journey over the last 3 decades of the AS400 I-Series and IBM I platform, we sit today in 2020 running Power 9 or Power 8 technology for the most part, and we're running IBM I, and realizing that this technology is going to continue to grow. IBM has a clear roadmap for IBM I for the next decade.
Yeah, so let's start our educational process. We've done a little bit on the history and so forth around AS400 IBM I. Let's talk about the database structures that are available in the platform. The traditional structure of the storage on AS400 was a library structure, which was a very horizontal hierarchy. So a library could contain objects, but a library couldn't contain other libraries. So it's not a hierarchical type structure. So there are certain operating system or IBM type libraries. There's also vendor type libraries. So for instance, you'll see on some systems, you might see our robot schedule product, and that would be in a library called Robot Lib, and that's where our program and file objects and all the rest of the object types that support our application. All right, now back many years ago, in order to support languages that require a more hierarchical structure, and to support the POSIX standard of a data hierarchy, the integrated file system, or the IFS, was added to the system. And in fact, now the library structure is just one of those structures that hangs off of the directory structure or the integrated file system. The integrated file system allows IBM I, for instance, to support file share technology. We talk about, when that originally came out, how great it was, and now we talk about how important it is to make sure you secure your file shares. You can access the integrated file system using the work with object links command. You can use the Navigator GUI. Ash is going to talk about that, so you can get at it through the command line or the graphical interface. Ash, let's talk about terminology.
Yeah, so let's go I guess back to basics. So I think most people are familiar with VMs. We talk about VMs in the open system and the Windows world. We can talk about IBM I VMs. In fact, I've spun one up in the cloud today, but really we're talking about partitions. So we're talking of a slice of that big cake that is a Power machine. And as we go down the list here, a PTF, often called a program temporary fix. This is a patch, and these can actually be permanent patches or temporary patches, and they can be applied immediately, just at the stroke of a command, or some of them can be applied delayed. Some of them, there is the insistence is they're applied delayed, so they have to be applied with what we call an IPL, which is it's just, to coin a phrase, it's a reboot in all intents and purposes, and it's a lot quicker these days than it used to be. Sometimes it used to take up to an hour. Today, maybe 10 minutes, depending on your application. DASD, I hadn't heard of this term for a long time. This, I think this was coined from the mainframe days, and it's a generic term for disk, whether that's spinning, solid state, or external SAN. An ASP is auxiliary storage group. So this is a logical group of disks. So in the Unix world, I guess the equivalent would be a volume group or some kind of volume group. Main memory is often called RAM. Memory pool, now this is a neat way of allocating a specific amount of memory to particular workloads or particular subsystems. So you can prioritize how much gets used for particular users, particular applications, and you can shunt that around as well, depending on the day and the date. And of course, IBM can be referred to as legacy, as we talked about, when really, although it's capable of running legacy code and applications, it can also house the very latest open source solutions too, which we're going to talk about a little later. Green screen versus GUI. Let's go into the next slide, Chuck. Now, this section always provides debate when I share this at a face-to-face meeting. What many call green screen, when in actual fact it's a black screen with bright green text on. And for many of you, this command line interface was the only option for sysadmins or operators, as we used to call them. And we liked it. It was quick, it was responsive, there weren't many moving parts, you could type ahead, and going back to pre-PC days, you could use the record and play buttons on your keyboard to save your fingers doing that work. Now, many still use this via Telnet, but it isn't the only option now for sysadmins. And many of those that are new to the platform, this is probably not their first choice. IBM's Access Client Solutions, or ACS for short, is a great bag of tricks now. It has a lot of tools in there, and included in it is a 5250 emulator. So what do we see here? This tends to be where the newbies get started. This is IBM Navigator for I, and this is the go-to interface for sysadmins, and replaced the clunkier Ops Navigator a few years ago. To open it, you simply point your favorite browser and navigate to http:// system name or IP address, then :2001, and it'll bring a login page that when you sign in, you'll be given all these options down the left-hand side. Now, the only software requirement to run this is IBM host servers. So this is option 12 when you install the operating system, and typically this tends to be installed by default. The cloud partition I spun up this afternoon, this had this in place. There's also mobile support provided as well. That's provided by a license program. So that's IBM I Access for Web, or 5770XH2. And it's really workable. So you can use your cell phone to manage the box. If you're not familiar or confident with IBM I commands, this should be a starting point. In fact, there are some tasks that you can only do in here that don't have a command line equivalent. And I can see that pattern continuing as we go through the years.
Well, Ash, that's a great segue into our next section. Menus, commands, and help. This is one of the areas that I was really impressed when I was first introduced to AS400, because it seems so well organized. And what I mean by that, first of all, is that IBM created a whole bunch of different menus, first of all, for managing the system. And the menus are accessed by using the go command. So go is actually a command. So for instance, if you want to find the commands and the functions related to backing up your system, or for doing a restore, or security related information, or security functions that you can run to make sure your system is nice and secure, go manage sys, go license program to see what's loaded on your system. And then also there's a menu called Go Major that gives you all the major categories of functional areas on the system, and you can branch off from there. So they've done a really good job organizing all that. So it looks something like this. For an IBM menu, you'll see the menu name in the upper left-hand corner. You may not see that on all menus. A vendor menu may not necessarily have the menu name in the upper left-hand corner, but that's just best practice. And you'll see a function key at the bottom, F23, that says set initial menu. Given the right amount of authority on your user profile, you can actually set what menu you see when you first sign on to the green screen. It might be the main menu. It could be another one of the menus.
I didn't know that, Chuck. I've never seen that option before.
Oh, okay. There you go.
Thank you.
Maybe you're not authorized to it. I don't know. Okay, so another thing that IBM did a really good job with is creating menus that point to a group of commands. So for instance, they created a menu called command change. So anytime you want to find a command, all you have to do is type go space CMD, and then the functional area or the category of the command. So for instance, there's display commands, there's change commands, there's work commands, there's save commands, and so forth. And over time, you're going to learn what those 3-letter abbreviations are around commands. So that's the command structure that we need to talk about next. So the command structure is called CL, command language, on IBM I. And those commands are in the QSys library generally, supplied by IBM, supplied by the operating system, but there are other commands. For instance, our robot products, our Halcyon products, and other products on your system, vendor products, have commands in their library that you can execute at a command line. You can string commands together to create a CL program to execute some type of automated function. For instance, we see quite often that companies have put together a CL program to execute their nightly backup. And then the command structure itself is action and object generally. So for instance, we'll have a 3-character prefix indicating the action that you want to execute, like a change, display, create, start, delete, etc. And then what you want to act upon. Do you want to act upon a library, an object, a job, a user profile? That might be an exception since that's a 6-character object name. And then finally, the third part is the noun. You might be, for instance, display file, or it might be work with routing entry. All right, so those are a combination of these 3 categories: action, object, and noun. One of the great things that IBM did is, and they didn't do this right away when they delivered the operating system, this developed over time. They developed something called the work commands, the work with commands. And the work commands, which you can find by doing go command work, are basically kind of a menu-driven command. So you'll see the object that you want to execute some action on, and then you'll see the actions or the verbs listed up above. Very, very handy. All right, let's jump ahead a little bit.
Yeah, so let's look at an example, WRKOBJ or work objects. Now, you don't need to remember the syntax and all the parameters for a command, which is good. I can never remember them. Simply type the command and use what will become your friend going forward, F4 prompt. I should mention here that commands are not case sensitive unless you're manipulating the IFS, that is. Now, if you've previously used a command during the current interactive session, you can retrieve it by using F9. You can go back right to the beginning of that session. And then in the summer, a new search facility was added to the F9 key, retrieve. You can type part of a command string followed by a splat or an asterisk, and press F9 and that will find that. And it's worth mentioning that there's an F8 as well. If you go too far with F9, you've got F8. Tip for finding command. We can't remember all the commands. Maybe Tom can. I can't, definitely. So some tricks to help you find the command that you need. You can use a wildcard. As I say, we could do a work splat, and that's going to bring up everything you need. A judge splat, everything that's prefixed judge, and so on. So that's worth its weight in gold, I tend to find. Command reference. Now, this slide is really for your reference. I'm not going to go through through all of this, but it breaks down the subject or category as listed. And I've listed some of the commands that go along with the corresponding menus. I often use the menu for files and query and SQL. It just takes the thinking out of it. There are far too many useful commands in the box to remember them all. So, so take that out of your head and just keep that. So where do we start? Well, right at the top here, and this is a good example actually of when to use the go command. So you could do a go-lick program, go-lick pugum, and then option 10, and that will show you the license programs that are installed. Now, the alternative here is display software resource, which is much more of a mouthful. It's easier to remember go-lick pugum, option 10. What else have we got in here? We've got license keys. So a delicate area. You don't want to mess around too much in them, but various products have license keys and limits on the number of users. We have the ability to see which and how much memory is allocated to particular subsystems. And again, that memory can be shunted around from that display. So just a word of warning there. And just one or two others there. Probably everyone's favorite command when they first get on the box, WRKOBJ. You can quickly see what's running right now. You can toggle it, you can subset it, you can sort using F16 on a particular column to see what's using the most CPU, etc. And then as we go down there, we've got work link. This is going to take you into the IFS that we talked about. I think Chuck and Tom are going to talk about the IFS. And then as we go through there, disk status, this is going to show you the disks that are allocated to the machine, whether these are spinning, solid, internal disks to the box or external disks. It's going to show you the disks this box or partition can see. And then config TCP. This is where we set the host name, we set the IP address. This is where we define what Ethernet cards and what addresses belong to those cards. So a real mixed bag of commands there for your use.
All right, well, let's jump into our first live demo. And I'm going to share my green screen, which is actually a white screen, Ash. So,
nice.
Yeah, and we see that a lot. A lot of folks color code their telnet sessions, so for production systems, test dev systems, and so forth. So the first thing we said is that commands are typically 3-character. All right, so 3-character abbreviations for the verbs and nouns. So for instance, if I want to work with objects, I can type that in. And as Ash said, you can press the F4 key. And this is one thing I loved about the operating system, because I grew up on more of the Unix world, and being able to prompt a command to get my syntax right. And if I'm not sure of a particular field, IBM, of course, has done a really good job building in help. And even for keywords, I can F4 on those. So now I'm prompting on a field, and I can see all the available keywords for a field, and I can drill into the help. So there's context-sensitive help. There's also command-level help. So here I'm prompting on the I'm doing F1 at the outside of a command parameter, and I'm seeing more of the help for the entire command. All right. As far as finding commands somewhat depends on your library list. So we talked about libraries early on. Library is it's not a hierarchical structure, it's a more flat structure, but you can manipulate the list of libraries that are in your current library list. So this is what mine looks like. So for instance, when I type RBT, all right, I don't see any commands, RBT splat, but if I do a WRK, now I'm seeing all of the commands and the library they exist in, QSys. So that's an IBM library. Now I don't need to type the entire prefix like a work. I could just type W with an asterisk. All right, now I see all the commands that start with W, so it's just the prefix, and you can enter in as many letters as you want. And then the other menus that we mentioned, for instance, Go Command Display. All right, Go Command Work. Here's all the work-related commands. All right, so those are based on the verb, but how about Go Command Save? All right, so here's all the save related commands. IBM did a really good job creating all these various menus. So in my opinion, it's a very well organized system for being able to find and work with commands. It certainly makes learning the operating system that much easier. Tom, let's talk about getting work done on the system.
Great idea. Let's get something done. I'm all about productivity. So work management on IBM I, this was created to really build a flexible environment in reality as it goes all the way back to the system 38 days. So it's something that IBM has built upon to allow you to basically run your different processes or jobs, as we call them, or threads, as Ash will talk about a little later, in different areas. So you can control what you're doing, and we refer to that as kind of a old name of work management, and it's certainly a very key part, and I think it's something that other operating systems would love to have in a way. So work management is all about controlling work as it enters your system, where it executes, and what resources it uses. A subset of that is a thread, a job thread. So when IBM added the ability to run Unix applications on IBM I, they introduce also the thread concepts. And where your jobs run is in the subsystems. And you have different types of subsystems. If you want to build out an environment that allows you to control and what memory pools and how much memory different areas are using, you can do that by jobs. And we do that through something called a subsystem. It's the place where the work goes. It's where we can control the resources that's used. There is, like everything else, there's an object type. It's called subsystem description. And then you can start and stop your subsystems with a couple of commands, start subsystem, end subsystem. You can modify jobs as they're on the fly and pool sizes and activity levels. We can control run priorities of your jobs and give different things different priorities. So again, that object type is a subsystem description in terms of what Chuck's talking about. And in my mind, so work management has really been a form of virtualization that we've had on the system for many years. And so you can really do VM or virtualization within VM on IBM I when you think about it. It's almost like the containerization topic that people talk about today too, if you want to equate it to something. These are just some of the common subsystems that we have running for supporting batch and interactive and communications. And oh yes, you can do HTTP servers on IBM I. Of course, you have a lot of today IBM I has become a database server for a lot of people. So you'll have people coming in with ODBC, JDBC, SQL from the outside world, and those processes are going to run in different subsystems. And then we think about the components of the subsystem. In and itself is where we control the memory pools. We have the concept of an auto start job, which is basically a never-ending job that starts up when you start the subsystem. Job queues for where our batch is going to run. Interactive processes are going to work either through names or station type entries. Routing entries is basically how we control individual jobs can go to different memory pools within the same subsystem with routing entries, and classes control the priority that they have. Communication entries, we don't use that as much anymore, and pre-starts jobs is a good way of spawning up multi-thread type applications on the IBM I platform. So Ash, what happens when somebody starts a subsystem? How does that work?
Well, it's a simple command, but there's an awful lot that goes on under the covers. So memory pools are allocated. You talked about these pre-start jobs. They get fired off. There's lots of other bits happening here. One other thing I should mention is the job queues. This is where you define the maximum number of jobs that are allowed to run and at what priority. So you've got some control there. It's not just open-ended. And as touched on previously, you can assign memory to subsystems. This is allocated upon subsystem start. If the memory isn't available, due to it being allocated elsewhere, the subsystem defaults to what we call base. So it's this common ground, and we can't let base get too small, otherwise we have problems. But yeah, job queues and devices are allocated to the subsystem that is started first, if I've defined them in more than one subsystem. And then next comes the comms devices, before finally the subsystem's active. So think about that next time you start a subsystem. There's lots going on there. All about jobs. So basically a job is, I like to think of it as a process that runs on your computer, whatever that computer is. These are a list of the most commonly used jobs on IBM I. And the most important point is that all jobs can be controlled, where they run and what resources they use. And again, it's not just open-ended, you've got control in that. You don't need to be a specialist, but there are some clever techniques there. There's one called a BCI, which is a batch immediate job, and typically they're started when they're started by pre-start job entries in your subsystem. And I think there's some people still running Domino on I, and of course WebSphere. There's some examples there. And what happens is a parent job spawns off other batch processes called threads, which are typically dependent upon processes running in batch. Very common with Unix. So that takes us neatly onto what is a thread. Now, threads are a way for a program to split itself into two or more tasks, running tasks. And conceptually, threads are just multiple workers in the same address space. Each thread has its own call stack. It has its own program counter. But all threads in a process share the same memory. If you just imagine two programs running at the same time, but they can both access the same objects, that hopefully helps you understand that. And again, threads first appeared with Domino and WebSphere on IBM I. Thank you, Chuck. So we've talked about interactive jobs, the green screen. Let's talk about batch jobs. What happens when we submit a job to batch? Well, based on the job description defined on your user profile, which can be overridden on the submit job command, SBM job, or via the job description on the job queue parameter, a job gets submitted to a job queue at some stage. When the subsystem is ready to handle a job, it looks for jobs in the job queues. The subsystem checks the job description for routing data and uses that data to find what we call a routing entry. And that entry provides information about which pool the job uses, which routing program is used, and from which class. And from which class the job gets its what we call runtime attributes. And again, an awful lot going on. Maybe we should think about that next time we submit a job. Thank you, Chuck. Components of work management. Now, this slide again is your toolkit for work management. We're not going to talk about all these, but again, it's worth keeping this printed next to you or in a screenshot. Some of these, such as activity level commands, can impact the performance of your server. So just use these with care. And I think Tom is now going to take a look at some of these commands in our next demo.
I am, Ash. Thank you. So you should see my wonderful green screen, which is truly a green and black screen in the traditional sense. And then, Chuck pointed out earlier that you can change that. And up above here, I have a toolbar where I can play around with my display and the color. Just a little sidebar there. But let's start out with worksys status as a command. Again, I can prompt that. I can print out the results. I can reset the stats. There's a few other parameters I can do, like different assistance levels on my commands. I'm just going to default to this level here. And, I like this command because it shows me my CPU consumption right now. It shows me that last time I did this was 58 minutes ago. It also tells me things like total amount of disk I have and % of my disk space that's being used, and a few other key things like temporary and permanent temporary addresses. Down below here are my system memory pools. Every system that you sign on to, I don't care where you are in the world, and it's IBM I, you're always going to have pool ID 1 and pool ID 2. After that, these pools are going to depend upon whether or not there was a subsystem that was started with them. And notice I have 7 system pools. If I press F11 on the screen, we can also see the memory pool associated with it. Notice we have a lot of stars in front of ours. These are all what we call share pools on the system. You don't have to have those shared pools. You can actually have something assigned specifically to that subsystem. Okay, so worksys status, kind of a fun little command. People use that for helping to tune the system. Then we have work active job. And again, I have additional parameters. We could put in a specific subsystem and a few other things that we might want to do. Most of us just default it. Next thing I see is my subsystems alphabetically, the jobs that are running in them, the user, the status of the jobs, and I can just kind of roll through this and show you there's a bunch of them. The other thing I can do is if I'm having a performance issue, I can come over here on a column and I can press F16 and I can sort my work active job. Okay, and again, I have F11. So I can see CPU, I can see IO, I can see temporary storage, number of threads. Notice this process here has 17 threads. This one has 72. Holy cow. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? We don't know by just looking at that, but we can see that it's not consuming much resources, so probably not a bad thing. All right, and then we can also do work subsystem. This is another command. I can prompt it. Let's see, do I have any? Nope, I don't have any additional parameters on it. And then we can see our active subsystems again, and we can then see our subsystem pool in comparison to the system pool. So notice like Insight has a system pool of number 7 on the system. And if we roll down, we have a 5, we have QSpool with 6, we have our robot HA with 4. So it's using different memory pools to run different business applications. And then there are a thing called work system values. And by the way, I'm doing F9 for those of you who are paying attention. And I can always press F4. I chose system control, but if I wanted to look at the system values for security, for edit, for a variety of things I could, I'm just going to hit enter here. And there are system values out there for controlling the system, kind of more from a work management overall standpoint. And some of these are pretty advanced. You will never, ever use them in my mind. Most people just set them up and go. One of them out there was the Q Startup program. So Chuck, back over to you. Probably enough for our live demo considering the time we have today.
Thanks, Tom. Yep, that was a good explanation. I especially like you talking a little bit about system values. That really comes under the heading of maybe a more advanced topic. And one of our top priorities that came out of our marketplace survey, year after year, these two come out on top: security and high availability and disaster recovery for those companies running IBM in their data center. So what do you have to think about when it comes to security and your IBM system? Well, first of all, you should be familiar with what regulations you are supposed to be adhering to. Are you a retailer and maybe PCI is high on your list? Are you in a state that has certain data security standards that you must abide by for private information? Are you healthcare in any way, shape, or form? Is HIPAA affecting you? GDPR, of course, has been it came out as more of a European guidance, but certainly we're all very much international companies, and so we must abide by those requirements. So you can see the percentage of companies that are dealing with those, the percentage of respondents in our survey that responded that they have these requirements that they must abide by. So we could spend several hours talking about just the basics of IBM security, but we have a quick start for you, and it's called the security scan. The security scan is some technology that we developed 17 years ago now, and we've been running these security scans across IBM partitions worldwide, and it gives you a report card. And it tells you where you might have some vulnerabilities in some areas of your security on IBM. So we look at things such as powerful user profiles, default public authorities, network access, system values, password policies, audits, the built-in auditing that's on IBMI and so forth. And we grade you, we compare you to best practices, and we tell you where maybe you can do some improving. And we'll give you an opportunity during the next polling question to request a free security scan from HelpSystems. Tom, let's talk HA and DR.
The next area of concern was high availability, and this falls in the whole area of backup, recovery. You know, the good thing is you've inherited an IBM system. It is highly recoverable. It is fairly easy to back up. Most people have done a pretty good job in this area, but some people have completely ignored it, and they don't even know if they have any good backups. We have some great tips on that as a sidebar and a blog and all those kinds of things, but we don't have enough time to go into that today. But Chuck did show earlier, Go Save. This is where we can go from the main menu into backing up the system. Now, there is one option I'll talk about, and that is option 21 on the Go Save. That will save your entire system. It will also knock everybody off the system. So be careful when you do it, but you should do it. If you've inherited a system and you have no idea, do we have a good backup? Take option 21. You can always go to IBM for your operating system, right? You can always go to and recreate user profiles, things like that, but you can't go to IBM for your data. So take option 21, back up all that data at least once, save yourself the agony of not having good backups. And then we've also included this nice how to save IBM I reference, the Go Save menu options 21, 22, 23, 23, and then to the corresponding commands over to the right that are being executed as a result of that. Save sys is the one where you have to have everybody off the system. Everything else here is negotiable. Actually, save live non-sys too is a restricted state command. I shouldn't say that. So anyways, good backups are important. Let's turn our attention to from backups to high availability and what people mean by that, or disaster recovery ability. Ash, back to you.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. I think now we're in the world that that boxes and applications are used 24/7. HA is pretty much a must now. And one of the methods of doing this is logical replication. And this uses remote journaling. It's built into the operating system, and distance isn't a problem typically. So you don't necessarily need to have a target on-prem. You could have a target at a managed service provider or in the cloud, something I'm playing with at the moment. And typically these solutions allow for role swap as well. So if you would have a problem on the production box, you could role swap to backup and run your application seamlessly. So that's a neat solution. Been around for a number of years now.
Or decades.
Or decades, yes, probably nearly 30 years now.
Yeah.
On the other side of the coin is PowerHA. And this is a rather logical replication. It's hardware-based replication, and it's typically active-passive. So your production machine is active. You can't really do anything with the backup side of things. It's dormant in effect, and it needs a PowerHA license, and is centered really around independent auxiliary storage pools, or IASPs, that really aren't as scary as they sound. And there are a number of options depending on where your production and backup servers reside, how much data sits in an IASP. And for those objects that can't live in an IASP, and there's quite a few of them, there's an accompanying admin domain. So that's typically user profile and configuration items. And we quite often see that PowerHA and logical replication dovetail together. So it tends to be horses for courses, really. It depends on your requirements and what your infrastructure is as to which one we would recommend.
All right, Ian, that brings us to our next polling question. And this is really where you guys can ask for help. Would you like a guided automation assessment where we walk you through your system, which you might not be very familiar with, and we ask you to run some commands and we help you decide what level of automation you're at? Would you like one of those security scans? I think that's a no-brainer. Everybody should do a security scan on their system at least once a year. Would you like a robot or a power tech or any kind of HelpSystems product health check? Maybe you're not familiar with one of the product lines that's installed, and for instance, are you doing purging on that system? Are you taking advantage of some of the advanced features? You may only be using green screen, where we've had a GUI for that application for 15 years or more. We also do something called a tech update, and a tech update conversation. We talk about the products that you own. We talk about the roadmap for those products. We talk about what HelpSystems does in general now outside of IBMI. We do a lot of things outside of IBMI. In fact, that's the majority of our business now. And we also provide professional services and IBMI trainings. So feel free to select any or all of those if you'd like and submit that off. And while we're doing that, Ian, do we have any questions?
Sure. Let me open up the Q&A file. Is there an option to save spool files?
I'll take that one, Chuck. The answer is yes. On your save lib command, S-A-V, L-I-B, as you scroll down, there is a spool file data option, and you can do star all. And the way that works is if the library contains the object called OutQ in there, and it has spool information in it, or let's call them reports, that will back them up.
All right, poll is still open, so please do fill out that poll, and you can send in the questions using the Q&A panel. We'll
Just
answer
a
them
little
now.
add-on to that. You
Go
can
ahead.
also replicate spool files using a tool like RobotHA. We can replicate them from one system to another too, as another form of backup.
All right. I actually don't know if
And
there's an answer to this question, but I'd be interested to hear. Where does one get a list of business applications available for the I, AIX, and Linux?
funny you should ask. Can you move on to our last slide too, by the way? Or the other slide with the HelpSystems? Nope.
Oh, yep.
Chuck,
I'll
you
do
got
that,
that one?
Tom.
You do that,
Yeah,
Chuck.
I got
That's
it.
right.
I
Chuck
got
has
it.
a slide deck. Hey, this is
Yeah.
live, right? While I answer this question, again, I told you I'm a power champion. I was in a meeting yesterday working with some of the executives from Rochester and Austin, where the IBM I, AIX, and Linux operating systems are kind of built from or supported from on Power. And I kind of asked them the same question. There is a thing called the IBM Global Solutions Directory out there, a little archaic and at best, but it does work. But then also, like, Red Hat has just recently come out with their online store, which is a really good source for Linux on Power type applications. Otherwise, it's Google, or quite honestly, believe it or not, Chuck, Ash, and I spend quite a bit of time pointing customers to other solutions in the world that can help them out, from business applications to other systems management type tools. So, or Google. Google is probably your other best friend there.
Yeah, and the user groups as well. I'll chime in there. I think you get a lot of input from various user groups and participants there. Feel free to reach out to those. And like Tom said, reach out to any of us and we will give you some feedback.
Okay, this next one. Is there any option to exclude objects in a Go Save option 21?
I can take that one actually. Yeah, thank you for that question. So option 21 tends to be a blanket save. It's going to save your whole box. There's not the ability to exclude any particular libraries or objects there. But if you start to break down Go Save option 21 manually, so that would be a savsys, a non-sys, a sav DLO. On the non-sys, you can exclude particular libraries. So I guess you'll need to break it down in order to do some kind of excludes there.
Which is a good tip, Ash, because that's again what it's all about. It's all about saving your data. By the way, while we have the next question coming up, we have this background slide. Just so you know, HelpSystems does backup and recovery HA technology, document management, cybersecurity, monitoring, business intelligence, capacity planning, and automation software around IBMI. And to Chuck's point earlier, we can reach out to Windows, Unix, and Linux from IBMI and provide automation and all these things for those platforms too, from centered around IBMI or even from the other focus if you want. Next question, please.
So maybe somebody in the panel has a sense of this. Are most applications in IBMI still written in RPG today?
I'll take that. We have the IBMI Marketplace survey that we put out, which is a free downloadable piece, by the way. And inside that, we address open source, common languages, and RDI, kind of the application development area. And RPG is still heavily used. It was somewhere in the neighborhood of 80%, but we allow people to select multiple languages like PHP, open source technology, COBOL even for that matter, SQL. So a lot of SQL on the platform and a lot of CL, which is our control language, which in a way we didn't talk about that today, but it's really the scripting language that you can write really program objects to run various things like work management, et cetera.
Yeah, and IBM has very much modernized the RPG language with the RPG free format, and when using Rational Developer for IBMI as your Eclipse-based development technology, you will have very productive developers that may not have ever touched RPG until maybe 2 months ago. And it'll look very familiar to them.
Okay, last chance for questions. Send them in the Q&A panel, bottom of the screen. Select to send to everybody. There is a question, a suggestion on best place to learn RPG freeform. Let me do a quick plug for the Common RPG Bootcamp, which is a 12-part series with resources and a workbook and code samples that you can learn RPG from, and that's at common.org. I talked over somebody. Was that Tom?
No, that was me. I was just going to say, awesome place to go for education is common.org. If you want to learn about programming languages, systems admin functions, you name it, anything centered around IBMI, they do a great conference. They just came off their virtual conference that is normally an in-person conference. And if we all had a magic crystal ball, we'd probably be able to predict when you might have your next in-person one, Ian, but we don't.
Yeah. Next one is planned for May in Columbus, so knock on wood.
We'll see.
Yeah. Okay, seeing no further questions, why don't we go ahead and end today? Thank you, Chuck. Thank you, Ash. And thank you, Tom. Thank you to everybody in the audience. Great job.